Okay, we're going to cover learning theories separately because I thought you needed a break. And sometimes these can be overwhelming because there's so many and so much into one chapter. So, of course, the learning theories are a little bit different. All behavior is basically thought to be learned in these theories, right? There's an outside influence affecting the observable behaviors. We have a regular learning theorist, Skinner, Thorndike, hold on, Pavlov, etc. So I know I keep talking about the CPCE and the NCE, and I'm going to go ahead and tell you guys in this lecture that we had an overwhelmingly positive response in our first administration of CPCE. So that's extremely positive for all of you. Um, but it's really on my brain, and I want to make sure that the things that we don't talk about a lot, that you know in the courses, things to highlight, things to go back to, and things to remember that perhaps would be on the test. And I know it can be different now, but I know that when I took the test, I had to know all the different unconditioned and conditioned responses and stimuli for classical conditioning based on Little Albert or the dogs, I can't remember, but with the fear of the rat for Little Albert. So you really just need to make sure you know them so they can throw anything at you and you can say what's the unconditioned response, what's the conditioned response, etc. So we all already know about classical conditioning. We talked about it in foundations. We've talked about it probably in other courses. You might have had it in undergrad. We may even remember it from high school. So classical conditioning is when Ivan Pavlov, he would bring in like meat powder and ring a bell. And he would ring the bell right before he gave the dogs the meat powder, and he'd ring a bell right before he gave the dogs the meat powder. And eventually he would ring the bell and the dogs would salivate. The salivation would start because they're going to eat the meat powder. But then he brought the rang the bell and just the dogs would salivate. So they had a conditioned response to the bell. So let's go through each one of these. The salivating to the meat powder. So the salivating was the unconditioned response, all right, and then to the meat powder was the unconditioned stimulus. So the stimulus, that's before the experiment takes place. The bell was neutral only until it was a neutral stimulus until the dog started to associate the bell with the meat powder. Eventually, that bell sound, it became the conditioned stimulus, and the salivation was conditioned response. So that's after it occurs, right? After it's been conditioned. And you can go through, the case of little Albert. Conditioned Albert to be afraid, made a loud noise with the white rat, and conditioned him to be fearful of the rat. Um, so impairing the loud noise was the unconditioned stimulus, right? The white rat was neutral until it was conditioned. Then Albert developed a fear, a conditioned response of white rats. Watson introduced also a loud noise when paired with the rat, and that was an unconditioned stimulus and led to a fear response, which is the natural response. He paired the rat with the loud noise, and then we had the conditioned response, which is Albert's fear of the rat. So, using this theory to look at human behavior, we use this theory in substance abuse, and obviously, I'm a huge proponent of this being a theory for trauma. I believe and see that people have conditioned trauma responses. Their body actually begins to respond in a fear-based response, like little Albert, when certain things occur. It could be the time of day, it could be the wind, it could be a color, it could be a smell, it could be a sound, and it conditions them to have a fear response. And they have no control over it and often have no idea why they feel the way that they do. If you want a simpler explanation, you can think about substance abuse. Craving drugs, being triggered to crave drugs. There's a true craving response for just like the meat powder in the brain. And those people who have been using substances, they get conditioned to all sorts of trigger cues that let their brain know the drug's coming. And so we spend an inordinate amount of time on classical conditioning when we are doing substance abuse treatment. Mostly every program that you would implement in group or individual therapy would use this as a modality. I hope that's a little bit more interesting than it'd be a lot more interesting if we're in front of each other. But anyway, okay. Thorndike, Thorndike's law of effect. This is the cats, where you use the cat kind of for the stimulus response, and they have the puzzle boxes, so the cat would get in the box and learn to escape from the puzzle box by pressing the lever, and there was obviously a response when the door opened. So the lever was the stimulus, and the response was the door. And these associations can be strengthened or weakened depending on the nature and frequency of the stimulus and response pairing. All right, let's move on to Skinner's operant conditioning. We also use this in substance abuse treatment in a court-mandated program. So this is operant conditioning. So this is reinforcing behavior and punishing behavior. And there's different types of reinforcement. There's positive and negative punishment. And then there's different ratio and interval schedules for reinforcement. I would, again, suggest that you understand each one of these in detail. I'm going to ask you about them, and you need to know them for CPCE and NCE. I think they do change the questions up some, but okay. So in drug court, we use operant conditioning. We would reinforce behavior we wanted to see in positive ways, and we would also punish. So let's kind of go through that as an example. Reinforcements are consequences that strengthen or increase the frequency of the behavior. So they're consequences. Punishments are adverse events that decrease the frequency of the behavior they follow. So let's take it one by one. Okay, so positive reinforcement in drug court is praise and reward. We would do the praise tickets. So sometimes if I wanted to reinforce the behavior and all going on my microwave with my microphone wasn't working. Is it working now? I guess you guys will email me and tell me if it's not. It's moving. Okay, sorry. So we would want to positively reinforce the behavior we were seeing, and we would give them a ticket, and they would get a chance to win something like a movie ticket. Okay. And the negative reinforcement is when we take away something. So that's when we stop doing something, but we're not necessarily giving you a reward. So it could be the removal of something. So we might have removed their curfew. We might have at some point had an extended their curfew, or we may have rolled that back a little bit. Okay, so they still have some freedom, but they lost a little bit of freedom, or they got no praise, they got no tickets, right? So they got no recognition in the court, nothing positive recognition wise. So we didn't like punish them, so we didn't send them to jail, so it wasn't some kind of punishment, but we didn't recognize them either, right? So it wasn't we want to reinforce that, we want them to want to go to that positive reinforcement. I tell you, I'm watching a cat right now, so I'm a little distracted. There's a black and white cat outside while I'm doing this. So, here we are at home trying to focus, right, guys? So let's do punishments. These are adverse events that decrease the frequency of the behavior they follow. And back to say negative reinforcement is also like maybe you clean your room. In the book, it talks about um, your parents don't nag you anymore, but they didn't give you $5 because you did it. That might even help even more. Okay, positive punishment versus negative punishment. A parent may choose to nag, which is positive punishment, his daughter for hitting her brother, or the intention to decrease the behavior of hitting the brother. So negative punishment is taking something away. So an actual maybe grounding kind of situation where they took something away. In either case, it is very important to know that you have to reinforce and punish for the behavior to be extinguished. You can't just use punishment to extinguish the behavior. The example in the book talks about trying to help your adolescent quit smoking. If you just punish them but you don't reward them, it's very difficult to extinguish the behavior. And this is really important for those of you who are going to be working with teens, with parents, and etc., because they often don't understand that at all. They only want to punish. They don't want to positively reinforce at all. And so there's no incentive for the child. Um, there's nothing positive about it. So very, very important for you to help people to understand that. And you can use this in your clinical work. And I think that's where these theories play out. And sometimes I think it's hard for people to understand why it's so important you know a lot of these things. And this is why. All right, let's talk about these different kinds of reinforcement schedules. I lost my cursor. So these schedules really explain how and when you apply these principles. So let's talk about the fixed ratio. That is the reinforcement after a specific number of behaviors. So you're like after the like one, two, third, three time perhaps, then the punishment happens, right? There's timeout or there's accounting. Um, so what happens then? The child learns they can get away with it for one and two. Then there's the fixed interval. This involves applying the reinforcement after a specific amount of time. An example of a fixed interval is getting a bonus at the end of the year. This schedule can lead to individuals improving their performance at the end of the year to look good because the bonus is about to be distributed. In a variable ratio, reinforcements are given following a variable number of responses. Sorry, I lost my place, guys. I can only imagine what y'all are thinking when you're watching this. Okay, there we go. That's gambling and lottery. There we go. Are examples of variable ratio because you don't really know how many times you have to play to win, right? So it's part of the reason why it's addictive and why they make so much money at the casinos. And then you have a variable interval. Those are when reinforcements are distributed following a variable amount of time. So a boss comes by the office periodically during the week, but the time and day she stops by changes weekly. This is an example of variable intervals because one does not know when she's stopping by. Therefore, one is more likely to be productive at all times, no matter what, because you don't know when the boss is coming. So you can see how important it is to understand all of these and not to get confused on which one. You may want to memorize those. And then we get into social learning theory. You guys remember the old Bobo doll experiment? Really important. Also will pop up on CPCE and NCE. Also make sure you read Reflection 2.2 just to make sure you got that reinforcement and punishment down. Just to reiterate that to yourselves. So Bandura, social learning theory. Let's talk about that. So social learning theory is just what it sounds like. You're basically able to, the theory is that we learn by watching our environment and modeling what we see in our environment. And the reason that Bandura thought this is because of the Bobo doll experiment where preschool children were brought in and saw an aggressive act toward a doll. And the more aggressive the act, the more the children behaved aggressively. And so the theory is basically that we are going to respond and act out or model what we see. And we see this all the time. right? And we use this in substance abuse treatment as well. So there are 4 conditions for social learning to occur. You have to be paying attention to the behavior learning. You have to be able to remember it by retaining it. You have to be able to actually do that. So you have to be able to reproduce it later, so actually be able to act it out. You have to be motivated to do so. Bandura believed in reciprocal determinism, that the relationship between an individual and an environment was very, very important. That was a mutual relationship, was reciprocal between the environment and the person. He also came up with the concept of self-efficacy. As we, as children, get feedback from our behavior, and we begin to believe in ourselves and believe that we can um, work within our environments, it develops self-efficacy. And we talk about self-efficacy all the time, right? We talk about the efficacy of this, the efficacy of that. But as therapists, one of our goals for a lot of our clients is self-efficacy, for them to believe in themselves, for them to understand who they are. Also in ourselves as therapists, it's very important that we strive to have self-efficacy. It's noteworthy that Bandura updated a version of the social learning theory, and it's now called social cognitive theory. Um, the change in the name reflects a greater emphasis on thinking, the cognition, as a part of development. And so it includes attention, memory, and motivation. So I'm sure you understand that. And the last one is psychoanalytic learning theory as a translation of psychoanalytic theory. Um, this is from Dollard and Miller. According to Dollard and Miller, they use the drive, the cue, response, and reinforcement combination to form the foundation of learning. What are those? The drive is a need that impels people to action. Cue determines when, where, and how people will behave. The response are the behaviors, and the reinforcements are the consequences of people's behavior. Conflict is related to incompatible responses or to one's inability to respond to the drive that's been triggered. So they identified 4 types of conflict. And this is definitely something that I've seen in the literature. I've even seen this conflict structure in assertiveness training, which was a part of substance abuse training as well. And it makes a lot of sense. So approach avoidance conflict occurs when the same behavior produces feelings of approach and avoidance. So you see how that conflict right there would affect you. Avoidance, when one is forced to choose between 2 equally undesirable options. Approach, 2 desirable things to choose from. And double approach avoidance occurs when one is faced with 2 choices that have both desirable and undesirable aspects. The way that I've seen this is this discrepancy inside of yourself to either be assertive or be passive. So you see how that you could see how that would work here. Approach, avoid. Should I approach? Should I avoid? Um, it's on a spectrum of aggression to assertive. So aggression, assertive, passive. So it's on a continuum. And so they use some of the same language with that, which I found interesting. Okay, I think I'm done. Here are some reflection questions that might be good for you to think about. And that's it. Okay, stop it. So, learning theories, which is the second part of chapter 2, is a little bit different. I mean, theorists believe that our development occurs through our environment, through our learning, through all of the different kinds of interactions that we have in the environment, like behaviorism. Touch a hot stove, I don't touch it anymore. Well, you hope, but you know what I mean. It's a hot, and that's how you learn. You learn that's not a good thing, and you're not going to do that. Or you hope that's how it goes. So basically, all behavior is just a response from the environment. That learning is a passive experience. So behaviorism hold on, I'm just going to go back. You guys know that when I try to do this, sometimes it won't do it. There we go. Okay, learning theories. I'm just kind of talking about learning theories. And then we're going to go into classical conditioning. But behaviorism has basically two types of learning: classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And I will tell you again that you need to know these in and out. I mean, I will never forget on my examination. I am so glad I learned Rosenthal's book because I did not learn any of this in school. We basically had a little definition of these, and I didn't know the response, the stimulus, etc. I actually knew more from undergrad psych than I did from a master's in counseling because I just glossed over it. So I love that this book actually goes into a little bit more detail, and I think it definitely went into more detail with you in foundations. But I have found that most of you have amnesia for foundations. So I go back and say, do you remember that we went on over that in foundations? And everyone just, it's crickets. Nobody knows what's going on. I think you're kind of like a deer in headlights to talk about learning theory. When you come into the program, don't know what to expect. It's your first time in graduate school. You're very overwhelmed your first semester, and it's a lot of information. I'm basically throwing everything but the kitchen sink at you in foundations. So I think a lot of that stuff is not retained, but of course we go over it in detail again, and that's why um, this is a developmental process. How'd you like that? Okay. I should probably start talking about, oh gosh, I just got a text. All right, let's talk. I would love to be able to fly on a wall when y'all listen to these sometimes. It's just quite comical me just sitting here talking to myself like you're in front of me. That's, I'm trying to make it interesting because let's be honest, look at the slide. It's so boring. I had to split this up because I knew by the time I got to maturation theory, I was bored and you were probably very bored. But remember our friend little Ivan Pavlov, right? And how we know about classical conditioning. I should probably pause and do this later. He would ring the bell and bring the food, ring the bell and bring, or meat powder as it is. Um, and then he would take the food away, or the meat powder, excuse me, yummy meat powder. Take that away, ring the bell, and the dog would salivate, right? So you condition the dog to salivate based on the cue. So let's talk about the unconditioned response and the conditioned response. Let's go through each one of these, and then we'll talk about little Albert.